summer series on the book of Ephesians, being a couple of weeks away now. I think we're finishing this series. And we're going to talk today about God being in the house. So let's read those 9 verses together, jump into it. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eyes on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. And masters, you treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. Now, all that we're looking at is based upon everything that we have read and studied in the book of Ephesians. So he's walked us through the process of who God is, and the living God, through Jesus Christ, who came for transformation and conversion. And we talked about a couple weeks ago, chapter 5, verse 1, that we're to be imitators of Christ. We're to mimic Christ. And then last week we talked about God being in the marriage. And so now Paul brings us into the home and into the workplace today. I want to reverse this a little bit, as I did last week. I think what Paul should have written better last week would have been husbands, honor, love your wives as Christ will love the church, and then the submit part. And the same thing is true today, that I think it's better to start with the parents instead of the children. So I'm going to start with the parents instead of the children. And we're given the phrase father, which translates for us, of course, into parents. Father, of course, when this term was written, men were the ones who worked outside the home. Women in the culture did not. They may have gardened, they may have been seamstresses, sewed, those type of things. But it was the man who worked outside the home. It was the wife who was the homemaker. And so this is talking about fathers as being the head of the home, the father who would have been the primary disciplinarian in the home. And so the word father is used. But here, of course, we're in a different culture. We're in America. Most couples that we know both work outside the home. In America, you both about have to do that to be able to make ends meet. And so you end up sharing responsibilities in the home. You share responsibilities in discipline. So these words apply to mom and dad this morning. What I like about this is Paul is taking a moment to remind us that parenting's hard. It's the toughest thing that you'll ever do. Why anybody would ever want to be a parent is crazy. You know what I mean? If you really stop and think about it, right? The energy that you pour in, the blood, sweat, and tears, the money. It says that you will spend about $180,000 to raise one child from the time they're born until they leave your home. And since some of them don't want to leave home, it costs even more money, doesn't it? And so it's a lot of investment that goes in. But what I love about this is that when you follow the biblical pattern, which America has screwed up completely, when you follow the biblical pattern that man and woman falls in love, they go through the process of engagement, and then they enter into marriage, and then probably a year or two after marriage, now they have a child, and you follow that process that, you know, it still is a hard process, because think about it, when you're young. When I think about being a grandparent now versus being a parent, and how many of you enjoy grandparenting far more than you did parenting? And there's a couple reasons for that. You think about it, when you're a new parent, you're young. So you've got the pressures of two becoming one. So you're trying to work out the kinks in your marriage, the pressures and everything that go with it in marriage and that relationship. You're trying to establish a home, so there's bills to pay. You know, there's rent, there's a mortgage, there's light bill, water bill. There's all these things to pay, a car payment. All of those things taking place. You're new in your career path, so you're trying to get established in a career. You're trying to move up the ladder. But by the time, if you do it biblically, that you become a grandparent, about 20 years has passed. So you've been married for 20 years or more. So you've had 20 years to work out the kinks, establish your career, get things paid off, and those type of things. And plus, the greatest benefit of being a grandparent, they go home. Oh, Aaron Wilbur sings that song, Blessed Taillights. And when you see them taillights pulling out of the driveway, praise God from whom all blessings flow, you know. So it's different, and Paul understands that. So he understands with all of these pressures, the youngness, probably still youngness as a Christian, and all of these things that go with still being a young adult with the responsibilities of a child, is that we have to be careful that we don't exasperate our children, or the King James puts it, that we don't, what does it say? That we don't provoke the kids to wrath. It means that we don't lose our patience with our kids. We don't become cruel. We don't become abusive. We try not to be unfair. We surely don't ignore them and their needs. And for God's sake, parents, if you make a promise to your kids, do what? Keep it. See, there's kids that have grown up all over us who are angry, rebellious, and it all ties back into their parents. Jill and I had been Thursday and Friday at a seminar conference we had been invited to at Liberty University with about 200 other pastors and their wives. And one of the speakers went through this thing of all the studies that show about an absentee father. Absolutely amazing. Of the crime rates and murder rates and who's in prison and abuse and all of these other things because they're from parentless homes or fatherless homes. The number of mass shooters who are from fatherless homes. So he's telling us our kids are the most precious thing in our life. The kids are what we have to protect. The kids we have the responsibility here to raise in the things of God. We're to understand that we're to discipline our children, but we're not to be excessive in that. Listen, parents, if you still have young kids at home, let me give you the best quote I've ever heard in my whole life on parenting. The bestest. And I was blessed to have read it about the same time I became a parent. You're not raising a child, you're raising adults. That's a game changer. You're not raising children, you're raising adults. And so everything that you do in this child's life is going to come to bear when they become an adult. So parents, don't exasperate them, don't provoke them. Instead, bring them up in the nurture, the training, the admonition, the teaching of the Lord. How many of us stood in a church and offered our children to God and dedicated them to God? That we pledged before God and the witnesses that we were going to raise our children in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. Take them to church, go to church with them, teach them the things of God. Nourish them, instruct them, develop them, prepare them for a life of following God and a life of serving God. When are they going to find that out? And then children. Keep in mind, by the way, children in the biblical is all children. If you're still living at home, how many of you were told, probably by your father, me, I was told by both, that as long as your feet's under my table, how many of you heard that one? As long as you're living under my roof, you know. So this children is not just talking about kids, it's talking about youth as well, young adults. As long as you're still in the home, obey your parents, for this is right. To obey your parents, just like you are being taught to obey God. There has to be law and order in the home with parenting, just as there has to be law and order in the home with husband and wife relationship, as we talked about last week. There has to be rules that are set forth, and those rules should be somehow biblically based as much as possible. Now, probably every one of us here growing up did not like all the rules that our parents inflicted. If you fall in that category, raise your hand. But how many of you, as you became older, thought, pretty good rule? I know some of the rules that I look back on now kept me out of a lot of trouble. Some life-changing situations that I was spared. Rules need to be set forth. Your kids need these boundaries. They need to be taught the things in which to follow, and they need to learn how to obey these rules, because everything that you're putting in their life is rules and boundaries. You're putting in their life for their benefit, that they be blessed, that their life be protected. And so kids, obey your parents as you would obey the Lord, and honor your father and your mother. That word honor means to show them affectionate respect. I'm going to tell you something. You don't see a lot of that no more in American society. Now, you go overseas, you see it, but not in America. The home in America has deteriorated so much. We've taken God out of everything, and you take God out of everything and take God out of the home, you've got not much left. Half the kids in America are being born into a single-parent home today. And so we have destroyed what the Bible has created. God has created as the family unit. Show your father and your mother affectionate respect. Well, I don't always agree with them. Show them affectionate respect. Parents, we're told stand in the place of God in that child's life. So when you rebel, the Bible teaches against your parents, you're actually rebelling against God himself. And this is the first command that Paul reminds us of that was given as part of the Ten Commandments, to honor your father and mother. It's the first command Paul reminds us that was given with a promise. That children, if you will do this, it says you'll live long and things will go well with you. Now, live long doesn't mean you're going to live to be 100 years old. It means you're going to live every day God has ordained for you to live. But things are going to go well with you. I think it's that Deuteronomy 30 principle. You know, where God says, I've set before you life and death, good and evil, blessing and cursing. Now choose. So you're choosing to honor your father and mother, and blessing will come into your life. And again, parents, let me just give you that warning. Your kids need your guidance. They need rules. They need boundaries. They need discipline. You know, just as we need that as adults in our own life. Proverbs 13:24 has some pretty strong words, because in today's parenting, you're not supposed to spank the kids. You're not supposed to put them in timeout. I'll tell you one thing. I know that American education system has failed these young parents because they failed in math because they can't count to 3. How many times you hear, I'm going to count to 3. 1, 2. But they never hit it to 3. Like, what, you flunk out of math, man? How long does it take a child to realize you're not going to get to 3? So here's what happens. How many of you know that kids can push all your buttons? So when you refuse to discipline when you should have disciplined, what ends up happening is you finally lose your cool. And so when you do top them, you do spank them, or whatever you're going to do, you do it too harshly. If you'd have taken care of it when it was supposed to have been taken care of here, I said no, no means no. So Proverbs says, he who disciplines this child loves his child. He who refuses to discipline his child must hate his child. Because what does he want in this child to grow up to become? It's a heavy responsibility to be a parent, but just as you chose to get married, listen, you chose. You chose. I don't care. You chose to have a child. So if you engaged in the process of what procreates, you made a choice, correct? And it's a heavy choice. It's a lifetime choice. Those roles change. My boys are now grown and gone. And the roles and responsibilities have changed, but you're still a father. You're still my sons. And there's still responsibilities that are there. Now, let's go to this last part. And I want to talk about the workplace, employer and employee. Here it is talking about slaves and masters. And because of that, I want us to take a few minutes and kind of sidestep from this a little bit. And let's talk about slavery in biblical times. So we can't dance around this. We need to understand this. The word for slavery in the Bible, particularly in the Greek, is one of the few words that actually has more than one meaning. It does mean a slave or a servant. Okay, a slave or a servant. You need to understand that when we think in biblical slavery resembles nothing about American slavery. Okay? That's the first thing you need to understand. So when you look back in the ancient days, you find there were three types of slavery. There was that called a bond slave. A bond slave, for the most part, that over 60% to 70% of those who have been a bond slave, what you and I think about as property, as somebody actually having control over someone in that sense, came through war. Now you go back and read the Old Testament, how many times do you read where it's told to kill the enemy? So when you go in to fight this war, that you kill the children, you kill the husbands, you kill all that, sometimes even the livestock. So this was a common practice among all ancient times, that you would kill off your enemies lest they rise back up to fight again. I mean, good Lord, how many times did Israel fight the Philistines or the Amorites? And so it just becomes on and on. So you see this concept. And the only choice to that, the only option is then you would either take them to be your captive or you'd kill them. Now, we read the Bible, the story, the book of Daniel tells us about Daniel and Meshach and Shadrach and Abednego. And they were captives. They were Jews that were taken captive by the Babylonians. They became bond slaves in Babylon, but how were they used? They all became leaders in Babylon, didn't they? They were high-ranking officials within the Babylonian government. So when they would come in, they wouldn't take everyone. They may take young girls, they may take some women to work in their homes and be whatever, concubines, servants, or whatever. They might take some of the young men to help build some of the projects they had in store. But they would take people who were doctors or could be doctors. They would take those who had skill sets to come and plug them in. So most of the time, when you think about slavery in the Bible, that's a bond servant is going to be out of war. This is true of the Roman Empire at this time, that it is estimated that 20 to 30% of Roman Empire was slaves, bond slaves, that Roman had taken through captivity as they defeated all these different countries, and they fell under the Roman Empire. But now, within pagan countries, understand this. Within the pagan countries, slavery was just like it was in America. That there were people who were kidnapped and forced and sold into slavery. And that was true of the pagan nations, but it was not true of the Israelites or the Christians. The second type of slaves was actually servants. They were hired servants. They were those who volunteered, literally, to be sold. Now, why would you do that? Well, let's back up. We're not living in America. This is biblical times. There's no welfare system. There's no food stamps. There's no housing assistance. There's no Social Security. There's no disabilities. There's no government programs. And so everybody is having to do what? You got to work. Everybody has to scratch out your own living. Yeah, you got rich, you got poor, you got everybody in between. So what if you can't find work? What if you can't buy a field to farm? Then to support your family, many of these would sell themselves for a period of time into slavery as a volunteer. And they would be servants and treated as a servant. And then you also have the indentured servants, the third type, or what is called a debtor slave. These are people who owe money that could not pay it back. And so, since I can't pay you back what I owe you, me or my child, someone in my family, is going to come into your service. And they're going to work off this debt. So, 2 out of the 3 types of slaves in the Bible were basically voluntarily as servants and not what we would think of as slaves. Pagan nations versus God's nation, the Jewish people, which carries over into Christianity. Go back and read the Old Testament, you'll find that the Jewish people could not sell or could not buy a slave that had been kidnapped or forced into slavery. In other words, they could not kidnap someone, they could not force someone into slavery, nor could they willingly buy someone that had been kidnapped and forced into slavery. You know what the punishment was? That if you committed that crime, death. Capital punishment. They would be killed. So what the Jews had, outside of those who had been sold through voluntarily means from other countries, or those who may have become those slaves through captivity, for the most part, everything that you see among the Jewish people and among the Christian people are hired and indentured servants. And even there, the Bible says, at the year of Jubilee, they have to be freed. The year of Jubilee was the start of the seventh year, meaning that any person who had been your slave, your servant, that you had purchased, these are not just people you're paying a salary, these are people you have paid a set amount to come to you to work, or people who are working off this debt, that at the start of the seventh year, they had to be freed. They were declared free. They could be redeemed by Jewish law at any time. In other words, if Jim had become a hired servant of myself to support his brew here, and he had sold himself into slavery to provide for them, at any time Elizabeth could come to me and say, here's the balance of what's owed. And I would have by law set him free from his service to me. Now you say, well, wait a minute. Is the Bible condemning slavery? Well, the Bible is dealing with slavery as something that existed in every culture, and it's something that was the option to being killed if you were captured. It was a pagan practice that had crept throughout the world. So he's simply given us the commands to how we're going to treat this. Even the Roman Empire had rules that could set slaves free. Even bond slaves within the Roman Empire could be set free. If I owned slaves who had come through captivity, or I had purchased, not volunteer slaves, bond slaves, anyone in my rule as a slave, I could declare them to be one of my heirs. So you had masters who had no children. And so they would literally make one of their slaves their heir, or two or three of their slaves their heir. As soon as they declared in their will that slave was their heir, they were set free from slavery and considered to be a child of the master, not a slave. At any time, Roman law says a slave could be given a bill of freedom. So understand that what Paul is doing here is not engaging, because this is a young church. This church is 4 to 6 years old when he's writing this letter. He's not tackling the whole issue of slavery at this point. He's just, okay, now here's what's happening. There's some of you who are servants and slaves, and now you're Christians. And there's some of you who are masters, and now you're a Christian. And so this is what you need to understand. But how this applies to us today is in the workplace. See, in the workplace, you're either an employee or you're the employer. So in that sense, you're either the servant or you're the master. And this is the way our system works. And I found this because I have worked jobs outside of the church, particularly through college and all those years. And I have found all through life, and people I talk to, that pretty much everybody in life never gets what they're supposed to get. You ever notice that? All employees seem to be somewhat disgruntled. If you find how many people just cannot wait to get to work tomorrow, how many do we have in this room? And I wish I could go right now. I wish they didn't give me a day off. And so we start thinking about, I don't make enough money. Somebody else is getting paid more. I'm having to work harder than they're having to work. I've been here longer, and look, they got the promotion. Or The employer, can you imagine like working for Walmart? Hey, that's a perfect example, Walmart. And now they're trying to raise their salaries, but for years and years, Walmart paying $9, $10 an hour. You know what Walmart made last year? Their profit last year was $16 billion. And here you are working and doing all this, and you're making $10 an hour, and here's people who are heirs of the Waltons that don't have to work at all, and they're going to receive billions of dollars, and they didn't work any. And you sit there, that's just not right. Then you need to try to become an employer instead of an employee. So here's what the Bible is saying as an employee. Obey your masters. So those who are your employers, you obey them. It says you give them respect, and you do it with a sincereness of heart. And you need to do what your employer is telling you to do, and obey them just as you are to obey Christ. Why does he keep throwing this into everything when he talks about obedience? Every time he tells us to obey somebody, he's telling us, as you would unto Christ. And he does it here again. And then you serve wholeheartedly as if you're serving the Lord. Listen, if you are a believer, if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, this is how you're going to work tomorrow. Now let me ask you the question, Christian people, who should be the best workers in the workplace? The Christian or the non-Christian? Should be a difference. People should be able to see that. So we serve wholeheartedly, Paul says, as if we're serving the Lord himself. Show that you're a follower. Act like you're a follower of Christ. And seek to win the favor as they look upon you. I worked at Solar City Mills during college. I also worked in a feed mill down in South Carolina during college. But during the college years, Solar City Mills, if you ever fed your dogs or anything, Chatham, pet food, dairy feeding, those things, that's what we made. An old 5-story building, no heat, no air conditioning in the whole building. My first week that I spent there, but this was a company great, allowing some college kids to come work. They let us work every summer. They let us work our Christmas break, our spring breaks. Any of those times they let us come in and work. And they'd give us overtime, so they're really good to us to help us out that way. But my first week there, you know what I did? I climbed up 5 floors of steps. I'm twisting and turning through this building that had been on the attitude. They handed me a hoe and a pickaxe, and I threw that down 5 stories into the bottom of the silo. I climbed down a straight ladder 5 stories, and I spent the first 5 days there chopping up dried corn in the silo. I stayed in there until lunchtime. I climbed back up those 5 stories straight up, and I'd come back down after lunch to quitting time. That was my introduction into hell. Well, the boss man there was a short guy, the plant manager, and they called him Little Man. Now, they didn't call him Little Man to his face. They called him Little Man, and he was a rough dude. He stayed on people. Now, he liked me. He and my brother played golf together and went on these golf trips and all that together, so I never had a problem with him. But I mean, you would be working some days because we do different jobs, and some days you'd be on the line or something with some of these guys that work every day, and they sit down and off in the distance, there comes Little Man, and they jump up and they start to work. See what Paul is saying? You just work. You work wholeheartedly, you do your job, you do it well, and then if that employer, that master looks at you, you win their favor. You're not having to check to see if you're working. They find that you're working, and you're one of their prized employees, is what it's saying. And understand here, no, maybe in the workplace you're never going to get the kind of money you want. Maybe you're never going to get the promotion that you want. But remember, for us as Christians, as followers of Christ, what is our final reward? Heaven. That's what we're trying to get, isn't it? Keep your eyes focused on the prize. Now, masters, the employers, he says you're to treat your servants the same way. You're to respect your employees. You're to treat them with fairness. You're to fulfill your obligations to them and your promises made. I'm going to tell you, just like I told the boys growing up, they had to get part-time jobs when they got old enough to do it, to teach them the value of work. And the other, I'm not making this and that. Did they pay you what they said they were going to pay you? Yeah. Did the check bounce? No. Then get in there and do what you're supposed to do. Give it your best. If they fulfill their obligations to you, is what Paul is saying. They treat you fairly, but any promises made, they're giving that. Understand, Paul says that you're operating under the watchful eye of God as an employee. You also need to understand that as a follower of God, you're a witness in your workplace, aren't you? So when other people see you as the root moaner, groaner, as the weakest link, that's not a great testimony to God, is it? If your employer sees you as a problem instead of a blessing, that's not a great witness. And then he says to the employer, don't threaten them. In other words, be just. You don't mistreat them. You don't treat them harshly. You don't punish without cause. You govern them with love and respect, not fear and intimidation. But to this he reminds both master and employee. So employee and employer, in God's eyes, you're equal. In God's eyes, you're not the employer or the employee, you're equal. How many of you remember the verse? God is not a respecter of persons. There's no rank. When we pastored down in Jacksonville, here we were in a Marine Corps community. 85% of the church were Marines. So now you got officers and you've got, enlisted. And so you'd have to tell everybody coming to the church, and here the officer and enlisted stuff stays outside the door. And here it's Fred and Jim and Blue and Bob or whatever. But there's no captains and no lieutenants and no sergeants in the church. We're equal. Now, you go back to work tomorrow, you may have to say to that man, yes, sir. You may have to salute him tomorrow morning, but you don't do that here. We're all equal. And what Paul is reminding us here is that we'll all give account to God. For whatever our roles is in life, we're going to give account to God. I want us to come back to the home. Husband and wife, parents and children. I want us to think about that because these are the greatest relationships within life. And God has intended them to be lifelong relationships. Friends come and go. But till death do us asunder. What Paul is saying here, to me, just registered. And Ronald Reagan, back when he was president, introduced a term, and among economists maybe it was a term they already knew, but for most of us, it was a new term that we learned, trickle-down economics. How many of you remember hearing that? And maybe for the first time, trickle-down economics. And, Reagan's thing is if we lower taxes and we got people had more money in their pocket, blah, 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 then this would trickle down. And people would have more buying power so they could go out in the community, they could buy more products, the economy gets stronger, blah, blah, things trickle down. I got thinking about that, and I got thinking, really what Paul is saying, this is trickle-down transformation, isn't it? That when you put God in your life, and you start following the ways of God, you start yielding your life to God's Word and to His will, that it becomes a trickle-down transformation. Every part of your life is being transformed. And here's the problem in today's church is we think being a Christian is over here and being a mom and a dad and a worker and everything else is over here. We separate, we compartmentalize. And no. What we're seeing is we're supposed to be Christian everything, right? This transformation and commitment to Christ affects and impacts every part of our life. So now, if I'm a Christian, am I a Christian husband? If I'm a Christian and a Christian husband, do I become a Christian father? If I'm a Christian and a Christian husband and a Christian father, am I a Christian son? Because I have parents as well. If I'm all of these things, and now I'm in the workplace, am I a Christian worker? Now, how many of you understand that's what the Bible's saying? God's supposed to impact every part of our life. We can't separate, and I'm this at home, I'm this at church, and this at work. No, we should be the same constantly. letting God transform us. On the front of your bulletin today, you have the words, and I forget the lady who wrote the poem, and then it was later set to music. Bless this house, O Lord, we pray. Some strong words, and we just want to pray this through song here in just a moment. But would you bow with me and let's just pray and commit ourselves to the Lord this morning. First and foremost, if you're here and you don't have